The horizon did not glow with the soft amber of a setting sun. It bled a bruised, malevolent violet that shifted into a searing, unnatural orange. It was late autumn 1842 in the untamed stretches of the Great Plains, a transitional zone where the rugged mountain men, fresh from the beaver-rich streams of the Rockies, found themselves vulnerable in a sea of waist-high, cured bunchgrass. Historical records from this era describe the great grass seas not as pastoral landscapes, but as tinderboxes. The harsh reality of the 1840s meant that a single spark, whether from a lightning strike or a mishandled campfire, could transform thousands of square miles into a furnace in a matter of minutes. For Silas Thorne and his small party of seasoned trappers, the smell of ozone and parched earth was the first omen. Then came the wind, the devil's breath, a sustained gale from the southwest that stripped the moisture from their lungs. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten physics of the prehistoric prairie. This was not a fire that crawled. It was a fire that flew. When the wind exceeds 30 miles per hour, a grass fire creates its own microclimate, a phenomenon known as convective fire spread. And the heat rises, creating a vacuum that sucks in oxygen from the front, causing the flames to leapfrog across the landscape. The trappers' horses, animals of keen instinct, began to scream, a sound that haunts the journals of every pioneer who survived such an ordeal. They didn't just smell smoke, they felt the vibration of the thermal column miles away. The dilemma was absolute. The fire was moving at an estimated 20 miles per hour, and in this terrain, burdened with pack mules and the exhaustion of a 1,000-mile trek, a horse could not maintain that pace for long. Silas Thorne stood at the crucial threshold of life and incineration. He looked at his men, hardened veterans like Caleb Vance and the young, inexperienced Elias, and saw the reflection of the apocalypse in their eyes. The sky had turned a suffocating charcoal black, blotting out the sun at mid-afternoon. This was the great dark day of their lives. The heat began to distort the air, making the distant horizon shimmer and undulate. It is a documented fact that large-scale prairie fires can reach temperatures of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. At this heat, the very oil in the grass vaporizes before the flame even touches it, creating a wall of combustible gas that ignites instantly. They were no longer running from a fire. They were running from a chemical explosion that stretched from horizon to horizon. "Backfire!" Silas roared, his voice cracking against the roar of the approaching gale, but the wind was too erratic. To start a backfire required a calm pocket of air or a natural barrier, neither of which the flat, unforgiving plains provided. The psychological weight of this moment cannot be overstated. In the mid-19th century, there was no rescue. No telegraph could summon aid, and no water source was within hours of a hard gallop. They were witnesses to the raw, primordial power of a continent that did not want them there. The horses began to lather, their coats white with sweat and ash. Silas felt the singe on the back of his neck, the thermal radiation hitting them before the flames were even visible over the rise. This was the moment of the great choice. To stay and fight was suicide. To run blindly was to be overtaken and consumed. Silas remembered the whispered wisdom of the Pawnee scouts he had traded with years prior. When the grass speaks in fire, the river is the only god that listens. But the nearest drainage, a seasonal creek bed known to be mostly dry in this drought-stricken year, lay 2 miles to the east. 2 miles. In any other context, a short distance. In the path of a wind-driven wall of flame, it was an eternity. The threshold was crossed. They spurred their mounts into a desperate, lung-bursting sprint. Behind them, the roar grew from a low rumble to the sound of 1,000 freight trains, a tectonic growl that shook the very bones of the earth. The sky died, replaced by a wall of crimson fury that promised nothing but ash. The rhythm of the gallop was no longer a sign of progress. It was the frantic pulse of a dying animal. As Silas Thorne and his men pushed their mounts toward the elusive safety of the creek bed, the world behind them ceased to exist in any form they recognized. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs and the material reality of the 1840s frontiersmen. These were men defined by their gear, the heavy buckskin tunics, the hand-forged traps, the precious canisters of black powder, and the flintlock rifles that were more extensions of their souls than mere tools. In the face of a prairie fire, these very symbols of survival became liabilities. Buckskin, when soaked in sweat and then exposed to extreme radiant heat, can shrink and stiffen, effectively shrink-wrapping a man in his own clothing. Black powder, carried in horns at their hips, was a dormant bomb waiting for a stray ember. The archive of life, for a mountain man, was his pack. In those cedar crates and leather panniers lay the records of a year's brutal labor. Hundreds of beaver pelts, cured and pressed, representing thousands of dollars in a St. Louis market. This was their pension, their inheritance, the only thing standing between them and a life of destitution. As the heat intensified, reaching that shimmering, distorted threshold where the air itself seems to vibrate, Silas watched as Caleb Vance made a soul-crushing decision. Without a word, Caleb drew his Bowie knife, a heavy carbon steel blade forged for skinning grizzly bears, and sliced the cinch straps of his lead pack mule. The animal, suddenly freed from the 100-pound burden of pelts, surged forward, but the archive of Caleb's life tumbled into the dry grass. Within seconds, the pelts, dense with natural oils, ignited like a torch. Historical records from this era show that the loss of a season's catch often led to a mountain madness, a psychological break where the trapper would rather perish with his earnings than survive as a beggar. But Silas Thorne was a creature of cold, hard logic. He saw the archive of life not in the furs, but in the breath of his men. The harsh reality of the 1840s meant that the frontier was a high-stakes gamble where the house always held the advantage of the elements. They were riding through a landscape that was rapidly being erased. The tall grass, Andropogon gerardii, known as Big Bluestem, could grow to heights of 8 feet in a wet year. Even in this drought, it stood 5 feet tall, dry, hollow, and filled with silica. When it burned, it didn't just smoke, it crackled with a high-pitched metallic hiss, releasing a blizzard of black carbon that blinded the riders. The sensory immersion was total. The sound of the wind was no longer a whistle, it was a rhythmic, guttural thrumming. The sound of a massive bellows pumping oxygen into a furnace. The smell was a suffocating cocktail of burning cellulose, the acrid tang of toasted earth, and the terrifying scent of singed horsehair. Silas could feel the brass furniture on his Hawken rifle growing hot to the touch through his thick elk-skin gloves. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. This was the history of the everyday, reduced to its most primal elements. The weight of a canteen, the grip of a saddle horn, the desperate prayer whispered in a language of grunts and heaves. To the modern observer, a fire is something to be watched from a distance, but for the 19th century traveler, it was a physical weight. The air density changes around a massive fire. The oxygen is sucked out, creating a localized low-pressure zone that makes the lungs feel as though they are collapsing. Silas looked back and saw the young Elias struggling. The boy was trying to save a small satchel, likely containing letters or a tintype from back east. It was a relic of a world that no longer had any meaning in this theater of ash. "Drop it!" Silas screamed, his voice a ghost of itself. "The earth is claiming it all today." This was the brutal truth of the westward expansion. The wilderness demanded a tithe. To move forward, one had to leave the past behind, quite literally, in the form of smoldering heaps of gear and memories. They were stripping down to the bone, shedding the archive of life to preserve the spark of life itself. The creek bed was finally visible, a jagged grey scar in the earth. But the fire was now a towering wall of orange malice, less than 400 yards behind them. The grass in front of them began to spot as embers carried by the gale ignited small fires ahead of the main front. They were being boxed in by the very geography they sought to conquer. Before we dive deeper into the archives of the past, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? As the party reached the precipice of the dry creek bed, the terror shifted from a physical pursuit to a deep, agonizing psychological isolation. To be a pioneer in the 1840s was already to be an exile from civilization, but to be hunted by an elemental force in the vastness of the Great Plains was to be erased from the world before one even died. This was the great silence of the frontier, now replaced by the deafening rhythmic thrum of a firestorm. Historical records from the period, particularly the harrowing accounts of early surveyors, describe a specific type of mental collapse that occurred during such catastrophes. It was a sensory overload that led to fire blindness, not just of the eyes, but of the will. The psychological isolation of the mountain man was rooted in the sheer scale of the American West. In 1842, there were no fences, no roads, and no silhouettes of distant towns to provide a sense of orientation. When the smoke, a thick yellow-black shroud of carbon and vaporized sap, descended upon them, the horizon vanished. Up became down, north became south. Silas Thorne felt the crushing weight of leadership in a vacuum. He was responsible for men who, in this moment, were reduced to panicked children by the magnitude of the threat. The young Elias was already beginning to shut down, a documented psychological response to extreme trauma, where the mind retreats into a catatonic state to escape the sensory assault. The boy sat atop his horse, staring into the flickering orange void, his reins gone slack. To understand this isolation, one must analyze the impact of the 19th century geography on the human psyche. These men were thousands of miles from the nearest courtroom, church, or doctor. In this moment, the social contract had burned away. There was only the self and the flame. The isolation was compounded by the sound, a phenomenon modern fire scientists call acoustic saturation. The roar of a prairie fire, moving at peak velocity, occupies every frequency of human hearing. It drowns out the sound of one's own voice, making communication impossible. You are trapped in a private hell, unable to hear the man 3 feet away from you. Silas tried to scream orders, but the sound was swallowed by the atmosphere. He was shouting into a grave of wind and heat. The history of the everyday in this context was the history of the lonely mind. As they slid their horses down the crumbling sandy banks of the creek, Silas felt a profound sense of cosmic insignificance. The mountains they had just left were indifferent, but the prairie was actively hostile. The isolation was not just physical, it was temporal. They were witnessing the death of a season, the turning of the earth into a charcoal wasteland that would not see green again for months. There was a crushing realization that if they died here, their bones would be bleached by the sun and scattered by the wolves before any human ever found the site. No marker would exist. The fire would consume their clothes, their journals, and their very identities. Silas grabbed Elias by the shoulder, shaking him with a violence born of desperation. He had to break the boy's trance. The psychological battle was now more dangerous than the physical one. If a man gave up, if he allowed the isolation to convince him that his death was inevitable and unobserved, he would simply stop moving. "Look at me." Silas's eyes, bloodshot and streaming with tears from the alkaline smoke, locked onto the boys. In that gaze was the only civilization left, the recognition of one human by another. They were now huddled in the center of the creek bed, a shallow depression barely 10 feet wide. To their horror, they saw that the creek was not a sanctuary of water, but a graveyard of sun-bleached driftwood and dry reeds. The isolation intensified as they realized their refuge was actually a secondary fuel source. They were alone in a ditch, surrounded by a wall of fire that was now leaping over the banks above them. The sky was gone. The world was a lid of smoke and a floor of heat. In this absolute isolation, the only thing Silas could hear was the frantic, uneven thudding of his own heart, a lonely drumbeat in a world that had turned to ash. The transition from a desperate retreat to a stand of absolute survival occurred in a heartbeat. As the party huddled in the center of the dry creek bed, the environment reached its thermal breaking point. This was no longer a fire moving across a landscape. It was a firestorm, a supercell of combustion that sucked the very oxygen from the men's lungs. Historical records from the 19th century describe the sound of a major prairie fire as a roar of 1,000 lions. But for Silas Thorne, it was more intimate and more terrifying. It was the sound of the world's end. The temperature in the creek bed spiked. The radiant heat alone began to blister the exposed skin on their hands and faces. The climax arrived with a physical blow. A massive fire whirl, a tornado of flame fueled by the intense heat and erratic wind, screeched across the bank above them. It didn't just pass. It hovered, a pillar of rotating fire that showered the men with white-hot embers and burning debris. This was the moment of the great sacrifice. The horses, driven beyond the limits of their domestication by the smell of their own singeing hair, began to bolt. One of the pack mules, blinded by smoke and maddened by the heat, reared up and collapsed onto Silas's legs. The weight was immense, pinning him to the scorched sand of the creek bed. "Leave me!" Silas roared, his voice a jagged rasp. But in the 1840s, the code of the mountain man, the unwritten law of the wilderness, demanded a different response. Caleb Vance did not run. Instead, he performed an act of raw, visceral bravery that defines the era. He threw himself onto the pinned Silas, not to pull him out, but to shield him with his own heavy, water-soaked buffalo robe. This was the history of the body. Man using himself as a physical barrier against the elements. The air around them ignited. The dry reeds in the creek bed, which they had hoped would remain dormant, began to flash over. Flashover occurs when every surface in a space reaches its ignition temperature simultaneously. The ditch became a kiln. Silas, trapped under the dying mule, watched through a gap in the robe as the world turned into a solid wall of orange. He saw the young Elias disappear into a cloud of black ash, the boy's screams cut short by the lack of oxygen. The psychological breaking point was met and surpassed. There was only the instinct to draw one more breath, however searing. The heat was so intense that the metal buckles on their saddles began to glow. Silas felt the mule's body go limp, a macabre shield of flesh that was now the only thing keeping him from being incinerated. This was the raw, powerful gravity of a defining event. It was the ordeal of the prairie, a moment where the frontier stripped away every pretension of human dominance. For 30 agonizing seconds, the heart of the firestorm sat directly over them. The vacuum created by the fire began to pull the very sand into the air, creating a stinging sand fire that pelted their skin. Caleb Vance's robe began to smolder, the smell of burning wool and hair filling the tiny pocket of air Silas had left. It was a test of the human spirit at its most elemental level. Could a man endure the sensation of being cooked alive to save another? Then, as quickly as it had arrived, the head of the fire passed. The wind, now a howling gale of ash, pushed the main front forward toward the distant horizon, but the danger was far from over. The breaking point had left them shattered. Silas pushed against the heavy carcass of the mule, his muscles screaming, until he rolled free into a landscape that was no longer recognizable. The creek bed was a graveyard of smoldering wood and the blackened remains of their horses. The sky above, was a bruised, sickly yellow, and the ground beneath them was a carpet of glowing coals. They had survived the climax, but they were now ghosts in a dead world. When the roar finally receded into a distant rhythmic pulse, it was replaced by a silence so absolute it felt heavy. This was the historical aftermath, the grim reality of the day after. As Silas Thorne pushed the charred weight of the pack mule off his legs, he didn't rise into a world he recognized. He rose into a landscape of obsidian. To understand this moment, we must look at the environmental transformation of the 19th century plains. What was once a sea of gold was now a flat, smoking expanse of white ash and black carbon. The aftermath was not just a physical state, it was a biological reset. Historical records from the mid-1800s describe the black desert that followed these massive fires. The heat was so intense, it didn't just burn the grass. It baked the top inch of the soil, vitrifying the earth into a crust that cracked under Silas's boots like thin glass. He stood alone in the center of the creek bed, his lungs burning with every intake of the alkaline air. To his left, Caleb Vance lay motionless, his buffalo robe a ruined, smoking husk. The young Elias was nowhere to be seen, likely swept away by the fire whirl or buried under the collapsing bank. This was the brutal arithmetic of the frontier. A party of 5 had been reduced to 2, perhaps 1, in the span of 30 minutes. The historical aftermath also involved the immediate biological crisis of survival. Their water canteens, made of wood and leather, had either burst from the internal steam or the water inside had reached near boiling temperatures. Their horses, the very engines of Western expansion, were gone. In 1842, being 100 miles from the nearest outpost without a horse was a death sentence delayed. Silas began the history of the everyday in a world where every day had been erased. He began to sift through the ash, his hands bleeding as he touched the scalding metal of a dropped rifle. To a historian, this scene represents the great filter of the American West. Thousands of pioneers and trappers disappeared into these voids, their stories never reaching the journals of the East. The aftermath was a test of the resilience of the spirit. Silas found Caleb's hand twitching. The older man was alive, but his eyes were swollen shut from the heat, and his breathing was a wet, ragged rattle, a sign of thermal damage to the throat. In this moment, the social contract of the mountain man was tested to its breaking point. Silas had no medicine, no clean water, and no way to transport a wounded man across a scorched earth that offered no shade and no sustenance. The geographical reality was now their greatest enemy. The fire had likely burned for 50 miles in every direction. There were no animals left to hunt. The bison and antelope had either fled hours before or perished in the heat. The birds were gone. The only sound was the wind, now cold and biting, as the thermal vacuum of the fire began to pull in the chilled air of the coming winter. This was the tapestry of history at its most threadbare. Silas Thorne was no longer a lead documentarian of his own life. He was a relic. He gathered what he could: a single intact knife, a water flask that was half melted but held a pint of tepid liquid, and the iron will to move. He didn't look back at the blackened mounds that used to be his wealth. The aftermath had taught him the ultimate historical lesson. On the frontier, the only true currency was the next breath. He hoisted Caleb onto his shoulder, a feat of strength fueled by pure, desperate adrenaline, and began the long, agonizing walk toward a horizon that was still weeping smoke. The embers of the 1842 Inferno eventually cooled, leaving behind a landscape that looked more like the surface of a dead moon than the American heartland. Silas Thorne's trek across that blackened void, carrying the broken body of Caleb Vance, became a whispered legend in the fur-trading posts of St. Louis, A story of a man who refused to let the prairie claim his last shred of humanity. But beyond the survival of one man lies a deeper, documentary truth. The legacy of the Great Fires is written into the very DNA of the American West. To look upon the plains today is to see a battlefield where nature and human ambition have fought for dominance for centuries. Historical analysis of the 19th century reveals that these fires were not mere natural disasters. They were the great resets of the ecosystem. The ash that Silas choked upon provided the nitrogen and phosphorus that would, within a single spring, trigger a prehistoric explosion of green. The resilience of the land mirrored the resilience of the people. This is the philosophy of the frontier, the understanding that to build anything of lasting value, one must first survive the total erasure of the self. The mountain men were the vanguard of a civilization that was often too loud to hear the warnings of the earth, yet their individual stories of sacrifice provide the emotional mortar for the history of a nation. Silas Thorne eventually reached a small winter camp of the Hunkpapa Lakota 3 days after the fire had passed. He was a specter, his skin leathered by smoke and his mind haunted by the screams of the horses. He had lost his wealth, his tools, and his youth to the flame. Yet, in the journals of later pioneers who encountered him, Thorne was described not as a broken man, but as one who possessed the silence of the stone. He had looked into the eye of the primordial sun and had not blinked. His legacy is the quiet reminder that history is not made of dates and treaties alone. It is forged in the moments when a human being decides to take one more step when the world is turning to ash. We study these moments today not just for the thrill of the survival story, but to reconnect with a level of fortitude that modern life rarely demands. The untamed past is a mirror. It asks us, what would you save when the wall of fire moves faster than your horse? What remains of you when your archive of life is reduced to smoke? The story of the 1842 Prairie Fire is a tribute to the unbroken thread, the lineage of survivors who endured the impossible so that we could stand upon this ground today. Their sacrifice is our inheritance. Their silence is our teacher. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us at Wildbound History. If you believe these stories of resilience must never be forgotten, hit the like button and subscribe for our next historical journey. Until next time, stay wild.